Today we are going to discuss about the topic dural venous sinuses. So before that, what are these dural venous sinuses? We know that the dura, that is the cranial dura, has got two layers. That includes the interstitial layer of the dura and the meningeal layer of dura. So in between these two layers, some venous spaces are located. So venous spaces which are located between this interstitial and meningeal layer of dura are called dural venous sinuses. But you know that some sinuses are located in the meningeal layer of the cranial dura. This includes the inferior sagittal sinus and also the straight sinus. These are the two dural venous sinuses which are located in the meningeal layer of dura. So we are going to discuss in detail about the dural venous sinuses. So if you are dividing the dural venous sinuses into two, you can see that there are some paired venous sinuses and unpaired dural venous sinuses. So which are the paired dural venous sinuses? So we know that there is an important dural venous sinus which is located on either side of the body of the sphenoid bone. So which is that important dural venous sinus which is located on either side of the body of the sphenoid bone? That is the cavernous sinus. So as it is located on either side, it is also a paired dural venous sinus. And the second one, we have the superior petrosal sinus. You can see that the cavernous sinus, it is connected to the transverse sinus by means of this superior petrosal sinus. So it is also located on either side. So it is also a paired venous sinus. Now another one is the inferior petrosal sinus. That is also a paired dural venous sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus. So we know that the transverse sinus, it is continuing as a sigmoid sinus, and after this it is continuing as the internal jugular vein, IGV. And the cavernous sinus is being connected to the internal jugular vein by means of another dural venous sinus. This is called the inferior petrosal sinus. As you can see in the picture, there are two inferior petrosal sinuses. That is, it is also a paired venous sinuses. Besides this, other paired venous sinuses are Spino parietal sinus, we have the petrosal sinus, and at last you have the middle meningeal vein or sinus. So these are the paired venous sinuses. Now you have some unpaired venous sinuses. So which are the unpaired venous sinuses? We know that there is a dural fold which is separating the two cerebral hemispheres. Which is that dural fold? It is the false cerebrae. And this false cerebrae has got a superior border which is attached to the lips of the sagittal sulcus, and it has got a lower border which is free, and both of these borders are having some dural venous sinuses here. So along the superior border, that is along the attached superior attached margin, you have one sinus, that is an unpaired sinus, that is the superior sagittal sinus. As you can see from the picture, it is also an unpaired sinus. And the second one, which is lying along the free inferior border of the false cerebrae, this is inferior sagittal sinus. Another unpaired venous sinus is the straight sinus. And another one is the occipital sinus. And you have the basilar venous plexus. Basilar plexus of veins. And connecting the cavernous sinus on the anterior and posterior part, you have the anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. So these are the unpaired venous sinuses. Now we are going to discuss in detail about each of this. The important dural venous sinuses among this is the cavernous sinus, but that will be discussed in detail in a separate video. So first you are dealing with the superior sagittal sinus. So what is the location of this sinus? Before that, you have to know one dural fold here. So this dural fold, anteriorly it is very narrow and it is attached to the cristae galli and it is sickle shaped, and posteriorly it is attached in a median plane to the superior surface of the tendorin cerebelli. So the superior sagittal sinus is related to the superior attached margin of the false cerebri. It is located on the superior margin of the false cerebri like this. So this sinus is the superior sagittal sinus. So what are the tributaries of this sinus? 1. It is receiving one vein, that is a superior cerebral vein. And it is also receiving some venous lacunae. These venous lacunae are actually receiving branches. These venous lacunae are actually receiving some diploid veins and some meningeal veins. And after receiving these diploid veins and meningeal veins, this venous lacunae is opening into the superior sagittal sinus. So in that way, it is having communication with the diploid vein and also the meningeal vein. Occasionally, the veins from the nose are also communicating to the superior sagittal sinus, veins from the nose. So this happens when the foramen cecum is patent. So another tributary is the parietal emissary vein. So there is a clinical application here. What is a clinical application? So there can be a condition where there is a thrombosis of the superior sagittal sinus. Thrombosis of the superior sagittal sinus. So this can happen through the spread of infection from the nose, scalp, etc. How? Because the superior sagittal sinus is having communication with the veins from the nose and the scalp, and because of which, if there is an infection happening at any of these sides like nose and scalp, it will be spreading to the superior sagittal sinus and ultimately leading to thrombosis of the superior sagittal sinus. So that is one application. So it can lead to some symptoms. Superior sagittal sinus thrombosis will be leading to some symptoms. So the symptoms can be due to raised intracranial pressure. So patient can present with a headache, vomiting because of increased intracranial pressure. So why this raised intracranial pressure occurs? Because arachnoid, villi and granulations are projecting into the lacuna as well as to the sinus. So because of that, the drainage of the CSS will be affected and leads to raised intracranial pressure and leads to symptoms. And it can also cause delirium and convulsions. So why this delirium and convulsions occurs? This is just because it is having communication with the superior cerebral vein. And because of this thrombosis, it will also cause paraplegia. That is an upper motor neuron type. This paraplegia is due to the involvement of the paracentral lobule. So that is the applied anatomy in case of the superior sagittal sinus. That is, superior sagittal sinus thrombosis can occur. It is usually due to spread of infection from nose and scalp. The symptoms, it can occur due to raised intracranial pressure, and because the superior cerebral vein is affected, leads to delirium and convulsions. It can lead to paraplegia due to the involvement of the paracentral lobule. And the next important dural venous sinus is the inferior sagittal sinus. Sorry, a few words about the superior sagittal sinus. So how this superior sagittal sinus is continuing? We know that the superior sagittal sinus, which is lying along the superior attached margin of the false cerebri, it is ultimately it is continuing into the right transverse sinus. So this is the right transverse sinus. This is an important point, an important question here. Superior sagittal sinus, it is continuing into the right transverse sinus. Okay. And the next sinus which we are going to discuss is the inferior sagittal sinus. So for that, again I am drawing the fold cerebri, sickle shaped fold of the dural fold. So we can see there is an inferior border which is free. So this is false cerebri. Lying along the inferior border of this false cerebri, you can see another dural venous sinus. So this is the inferior sagittal sinus. Lies along the inferior border. Of false cerebri. So what happens to the inferior sagittal sinus? It is joining with another vein which is known as the great cerebral vein of Galen, and it joins with this to form another sinus, that is a straight sinus. And the straight sinus is ultimately continuing as the left transverse sinus. So what happens to the inferior sagittal sinus? The inferior sagittal sinus, it is joining with the great cerebral vein and forms a straight sinus, and it is continuing as the left transverse sinus. So we have seen that the superior sagittal sinus is continuing as a right transverse sinus, but the straight sinus is continuing as a left transverse sinus. That is an important question. The next sinus is the straight sinus. Is it paired or unpaired? It is, of course, an unpaired venous sinus. So what is the location? For that, drawing the tentorium cerebelli. So this is the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli, and this is the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli. So on the superior surface of the tentorium cerebelli, we can see there is attachment of false cerebri here. Now, on the superior surface of the tentorium cerebelli, in the median plane along the line of attachment of the false cerebri, you are having a sinus here, that is an unpaired dural venous sinus. This is called the straight sinus. How the straight sinus is formed? It is formed by the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein, which join together to form. This is the inferior sagittal sinus, and there is a great cerebral vein which is joining to form the straight sinus. Where is the straight sinus going? It is continuing as the left transverse sinus. So the question here is how straight sinus is formed. It is formed by inferior sagittal sinus and great cerebral vein. Another question, how it is continuing? Continues as left transverse sinus. Some tributaries. So in addition to the veins which are forming it, it also receives some superior cerebellar veins. Superior cerebellar veins are also draining into this. Okay, that is all about the straight sinus. Next sinus is the transverse sinus. So first about the location. So for that you have to know the tentorium cerebelli, that is a dural fold. This is the free anterior part of the tentorium cerebelli, and we can see there is an attached portion of the tentorium cerebelli here, and this attached portion has got a posterolateral part, and this is the anterolateral part of the tentorium cerebelli. That is the attached portion of the tentorium cerebelli which has got a posterolateral part as well as an anterolateral part. So there is a paired dural venous sinus which is related to the posterolateral attached part of the tentorium cerebelli. So which is that dural venous sinus, which is a paired dural venous sinus which is related to the posterolateral attached part of the tentorium cerebelli. So the tentorium cerebelli is attached here to the transverse sulcus on the occipital bone. So along this attachment we have got a dural venous sinus which is located on both sides. So that is the transverse sinus. Transverse sinus. So that is about the location of the transverse sinus. Okay. Location. It is along the attached margin, posterolateral attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli. Now about the formation. So we have learned it. Formation. How is the right transverse sinus formed? So we know that right transverse sinus is actually a continuation of superior sagittal sinus. How the left transverse sinus is formed? Left transverse sinus is a continuation of the straight sinus. Now what happens to the right and left transverse sinus? The transverse sinus is continuing as the right and left sigmoid sinus. Okay, transverse sinus on both sides, it continues as a sigmoid sinus. Now a few words about the tributaries of the transverse sinus. So transverse sinus has few tributaries, that is superior petrosal sinus, we have the inferior cerebral vein, and inferior cerebellar vein, and we have the diploic vein, that is the posterior temporal vein, and inferior anastomotic vein. Inferior anastomotic vein. Okay, that is all about the transverse sinus. Now we are going to discuss about the sigmoid sinus. So from the name sigmoid, we can understand that the shape of the sinus is S-shaped. How it is formed? It is formed as a continuation of right and left transverse sinus. So it is draining into, or it is continuing as internal jugular vein. Okay, the sigmoid sinus is continuing as the internal jugular vein. So what is the location of the sigmoid sinus? It is located in a groove on the mastoid part of the temporal bone. So an important point is that it is separated from the mastoid antrum and mastoid air cells by a thin plate of bone. So the tributaries are of course from the mastoid and condylar emissary veins. Mastoid and condylar emissary veins. So mastoid infection can spread to the sigmoid sinus and can lead to sigmoid sinus thrombosis as well. So that is a clinically important point. The tributaries of the sigmoid sinus are mastoid emissary veins, and condylar emissary vein, and it also receives cerebellar veins and internal auditory vein. So infection from the mastoid can spread through the emissary veins into the sigmoid sinus and can lead to sigmoid sinus thrombosis. Now, few these important dural venous sinuses, some small dural venous sinuses are going to be discussed here. Next one is the occipital sinus. Just above the location. So this is the tentorian cerebellae. Can see the inferior surface of the tentorian cerebellae, and that there is another dural fold here, which is related to the inferior surface of the tentorian cerebellae. So that dural fold is the false cerebellae. Now, along the attached part of the false cerebellae, we have another dural venous sinus, small dural venous sinus, that is an unpaired dural venous sinus, which is known as the occipital sinus. So occipital sinus is related to which dural fold? It is related to the false cerebellae. It is located along the attached margin of the false cerebellae. So it is actually beginning in the near the foramen magnum, and it is ending at the confluence of the sinus. Now another dural venous sinus, that is the Spino parietal sinus. So it is actually paired. So right and left is Spino parietal sinus are there. And what is the location? It is located along the posterior free margin of the lesser wing of sphenoid. So it is related to the posterior free margin of the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And the spinoparietal sinus is actually a tributary of the cavernous sinus. That is, it is draining into the anterior part of the cavernous sinus. And each of this will be also receiving the frontal trunk of the middle meningeal vein. Okay, that is all about the spinoparietal sinus. Another sinus is the superior petrosal sinus. So this is again a paired dural venous sinus. What is the location? It is located along the upper border of the petrous temporal bone. As the name suggests, it is located on the upper border of the petrous temporal bone. It is also related to which dural fold? It is related to the attached margin of the tentorian cerebellae. What is the importance of this superior petrosal sinus? From the beginning of this video, we have learned that the cavernous sinus, it is connected to the transverse sinus by means of this superior petrosal sinus. So superior petrosal sinus, the importance is that it is connecting the cavernous sinus to the transverse sinus. That is, it is draining the cavernous sinus to the transverse sinus. Now a few words about the inferior petrosal sinus. It is also a paired dural venous sinus. So right and left inferior petrosal sinus is there. What is the location? It is located on the parieto-occipital fissure. So what is the importance of this inferior petrosal sinus? So we have cavernous sinus on both sides. We have the right and left transverse sinus here. It is continuing as the sigmoid sinus, and sigmoid sinus is ultimately continuing as the internal jugular vein. So the cavernous sinus is draining into the internal jugular vein through this inferior petrosal sinus. So this is the inferior petrosal sinus which is draining the cavernous sinus into the internal jugular vein. So the importance of inferior petrosal sinus is that it is connecting the cavernous sinus through the internal jugular vein. Okay. The next dural venous sinus is the basilar plexus of veins. So from this picture you can see the basilar plexus. So this is the basilar plexus. So it is connecting the inferior petrosal sinus on both sides. So this is the inferior petrosal sinus on both sides. It is being connected with the help of this basilar venous plexus. So it is this basilar venous plexus is also communicating with the vertebral venous plexus also. So what is this basilar venous plexus? It is a plexus of vein which is connecting the inferior petrosal sinus on both sides. Besides this, it is also connected to the vertebral venous plexus, internal vertebral venous plexus. Now, another dural venous sinus, that is the middle meningeal vein. So it has got two trunks. One is a frontal trunk, okay, that is an anterior trunk, and it has got a posterior trunk or a parietal trunk. So the frontal trunk of the middle meningeal vein, either it ends in the pterygoid plexus through the foramen ovale, or it ends in the spinoparietal or cavernous sinus. The parietal trunk usually ends in the pterygoid plexus through the foramen spinosum. So this is ending, the anterior trunk is ending into the pterygoid plexus through which foramen? That is the foramen ovale. And the posterior trunk of the parietal trunk, it is ending into the pterygoid plexus through the foramen spinosum. Another unpaired venous sinus is the anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. So we know that the cavernous sinus, which is located on either side of the body of the sphenoid. So we have one dural fold here, which is forming the roof of the hypophyseal fossa. Sorry, this is a cavernous sinus. So located on either side of the body of the sphenoid, we have the cavernous sinus. And this is the diaphragma sellae, which is a dural fold forming the roof of the hypophyseal fossa. So located in front and behind the diaphragma sellae, we have two dural venous sinus which are actually communicating the two cavernous sinus. So as it is located anteriorly, it is called anterior intercavernous sinus. And one which is located posteriorly is called posterior intercavernous sinus. So anterior and posterior intercavernous sinuses are actually unpaired dural venous sinuses which are communicating the cavernous sinus on both sides. So that is all about the dural venous sinuses. Among this, the most important dural venous sinus is the cavernous sinus that will be dealt in a separate video. Thank you.